Chancellor Merkel leads the mourning for 12 dead in the Berlin Christmas market attack. Police tonight release the suspect they arrested yesterday and say the perpetrator is still at large. Good evening. There are 12 dead in Berlin in an attack the country had been dreading. We know that at least 6 of the dead are Germans and 1 is the Polish driver of the lorry presumed hijacked. Beyond that, there is little clarity, with the police seemingly no further ahead than they were 24 hours ago. The man arrested last night has been released. Amid this renewed manhunt, Germany is going through the rituals of mourning. The Brandenburg Gate lit up and politicians have gathered at a church service tonight, the latest and the fallout.
Also tonight, talks on a deal to end the war in Syria, but without the United States or the United Nations. As the last remaining people are evacuated from eastern Aleppo, Russia, Turkey and Iran meet to decide Syria's future. Scotland wants to stay inside the single market, says Nicola Sturgeon, even if the rest of the UK leaves. Fracking gets the go-ahead in North Yorkshire as campaigners lose their fight at the High Court to stop it.
Plus, he and she are still alive, writing their novels and more. Tonight, how the British Library is capturing the archives of living writers. Will Self has 22 books to his name, but having told us so much already, can his archive tell us more? So, the only man arrested after last night's Christmas market attack in Berlin was released within the last hour, as police said that they didn't have enough evidence, admitting we may still have a dangerous criminal out there. 12 people were killed, dozens of others were injured when a lorry slammed into the busy market in what's being now described as an act of terrorism. Darshna Soni is in Berlin. Darshna.
18 people are still critically ill tonight, John. They are among the dozens who are injured when a truck ploughed through that most beloved of traditions here, a Christmas market. 12 people were killed. Many of them had been browsing the stalls. Detectives were initially reluctant to describe this as a terrorist attack. One officer was quoted as saying that the words they use would affect the way this event was perceived. And perception, of course, is hugely sensitive to the German authorities, following a summer in which an unprecedented number of refugees were allowed into Germany. Well, today, those refugees were again the focus of this story, because initially there were reports that the driver was a Pakistani asylum seeker, and Angela Merkel's critics were quick to jump on that. But in the last hour, an extraordinary development, John, because that man has been released without charge, and detectives have admitted they may have had the wrong man, and tonight a new manhunt is underway. It had been carrying 25 tons of steel. A truck that was deliberately driven into a crowded market. In the shadow of the Kaiser Wilhelm Church, a memorial to peace and reconciliation, it was a symbolic attack on a popular cultural tradition. 12 people were killed here, 48 injured. Tonight, 18 of them are still in a critical condition.
There are no words. There are no words of that terrorism here in Germany and all over the world, and this is very, very sad.
A suspect was arrested within an hour of the attack, and yet, after a day of speculation in the media about whether he's a refugee, German police have admitted that they may have had the wrong man. The Pakistani they had in custody denied any involvement, and in the last hour he's been released.
There are a range of possibilities to check evidence, such as cross-checking DNA with DNA found in the truck, discharge residues possibly on the hands and things like that. That is ongoing, but it is indeed, as far as I know at this stage, uncertain whether he really was the driver. The investigations are not yet completed. At this point, we haven't been able to confirm that the person was the driver.
The attack happened yesterday evening. The pavements had been packed with people browsing the stalls that sell candied fruit, waffles and Glühwein. German police are treating what happened next as a terrorist attack. This distressing footage was filmed on a mobile phone. It shows the route that the truck had taken as it ploughed along the pavement, crashing through the stalls.
A
truck drove in there and simply drove over people. And then I was over there. I saw how it drove in there, and then he ran away.
The driver ran off. Inside the truck, another man was found dead. He's been named as Łukasz Urban, a 37-year-old Polish trucker who had been in Berlin to deliver the steel. Detectives are investigating whether his vehicle was hijacked.
Stab wounds were clearly seen on the photo, which depicted only my cousin's face. It was really clear that he'd been fighting for his life. His face was swollen and bloodied. Police told me he'd suffered gunshot wounds, so despite being stabbed, he was shot dead.
The truck had a Polish license plate. Its owner said his driver had been due to take a rest break in Berlin, but he'd been unable to contact him from 4 p.m. onwards. Using tracking data, the owner said someone tried to turn the engine on at 3:45 and again an hour or so later. They then ran the engine without moving the truck for 45 minutes. He said it was as if someone was trying to learn how to drive it. Just after 7:30, the truck did finally move, when it was taken on its final journey and used as a weapon at the Christmas market. So who was the driver? The investigation today briefly focused on this former airport hangar, now used as a refugee reception centre. Within hours of the attack, police raided this shelter for asylum seekers. It's understood 4 men were questioned but not arrested. Angela Merkel is well aware that the attack could increase hostility towards refugees. Her critics have already blamed her open-door migration policy. And today the Chancellor acknowledged that if it is proven the attacker was someone who came here to seek refuge, then that would be particularly sickening. Mrs. Merkel laid flowers at the scene of the attack. She spoke of her sadness, vowing that those responsible would be punished. But she also acknowledged the political sensitivities surrounding the attack.
Noch wissen wir vieles über diese Tat nicht mit der nötigen Gewissheit.
We don't know many of the details about this deed with certainty, but at the moment we have to assume it was a terrorist attack. I know that it would be particularly hard for us all to bear if it were to be confirmed that a person that committed this crime had sought protection and asylum in Germany.
Der in Deutschland Schutz und Asyl gebeten hat.
Tonight, the Chancellor is attending a memorial service to honour the victims. She knows she is under huge political pressure, as do the detectives leading the investigation, with an attacker still at large, armed and dangerous.
Well, it didn't take long after last night's attack for the backlash to begin. A clamour of protests about Angela Merkel's open-door policy towards migrants and refugees. This has, after all, been a year when the fear of terror attacks has haunted Europe, a year which has also seen the rise of the populist right. Kieran Jenkins reports.
Rarely, but brutally, in 12 months in Europe, normality has been interrupted by terror. Even as the identity of the Berlin attacker remains unclear, parallels with previous horrors have been drawn. In Nice in July, a Tunisian with French residency drove his weapon through Bastille Day celebrations, killing 86 people. So-called Islamic State claimed responsibility. The French president did not have the answers, did not seek a second term. Now it's Germany's chancellor seeking re-election. Mrs. Merkel has come a long way from "we can do it." Her slogan rang in the ears of Germans as they opened their hearts and their borders to over 1 million refugees. She says much has been achieved. But her opponents shout louder. There was New Year in Cologne, the backlash against sexual assaults blamed on refugees and migrants. And now Germany's populist right is on the rise. Mrs. Merkel's rhetoric has become more hardline. A ban on burqas proposed.
She will have to produce results and show what kind of policies she will have in order to integrate all the people who are here, but also to show that the right-wing extremists are not those who are going to dominate our everyday life.
It has been a year of terror around Europe and its borders. In France, 4 major incidents in 12 months. Paris in November under attack from gunmen and suicide bombers. 8 short months later, the Bastille Day massacre in Nice. In Belgium, more than 30 people killed in twin explosions at Brussels airport and a metro station. In Germany, a teenager shot 9 dead at a Munich shopping centre in July. And in Turkey, 11 major incidents in a year which saw Ataturk airport attacked and the Russian ambassador gunned down at an art gallery just last night. Also last night, a shooting at a mosque in Zurich, injuring 3. None of this fits a neat narrative. This was also the year a far-right extremist killed a pro-immigration MP. Today, Joe Cox's husband warned Nigel Farage against blaming politicians for events in Berlin. Mr. Farage responded by linking her widower to extremism.
Yes, well, of course, he would know more about extremists than me, Mr. Cox. He backs organisations like Hope Not Hate, who masquerade as being lovely and peaceful, but actually pursue violent and very undemocratic means.
Hope Not Hate accused him of a political smear. But there are Germans who blame Mrs. Merkel too, even before the full picture has emerged. Terror has sown fear and exposed Europe's divisions, as it was intended to do.
Now, Russia, Iran and Turkey say they are ready to broker a deal to end the Syrian war after talks in Moscow held without the United States, without the United Nations. The meeting went ahead despite yesterday's assassination of Russia's ambassador to Turkey by an off-duty police officer who shouted, "Don't forget Aleppo." Just a few thousand people now remain in the city's last rebel enclave, waiting for a fleet of buses to take them away, as Diana Magne now reports.
Aleppo now is a story of forced evacuations and mass displacement. Its people pawns in the hands of great powers and men with guns. From the last rebel enclave of eastern Aleppo, the evacuation of invalids who wheel and hobble their way onto the buses which will take them away from their home, out of the apocalypse that it's become. The Red Crescent present as they have been since these evacuations started, but no sign of the much lauded UN monitors whose deployment was approved yesterday by the UN Security Council. There are still doctors who stay in the east to look after the last few thousand who are left, trying to ease the desperate pain of their passage out. And then they're dropped in rebel areas in the countryside west of Aleppo, where this war will continue for them. The same pounding from the skies, but with no home to call their own.
I left, but my heart is broken. Aleppo is my home, where I was born. It's the home of our ancestors. I hope we can go back. The Shia flags are in the streets. The occupiers with the Russians are gloating. Can this be right?
Like ships in the night, whole Shia communities are bussed into Aleppo in their place. From the villages of Fua and Kafraya in Idlib province, which were under rebel siege. Welcomed by Iraqi militias to the sound of traditional Shia songs. The man on the roof waves the flags of Syria, Iran and Hezbollah, because it is Iran who creates the facts on the ground here now, and its Shia militias who held up Russia's evacuation deal for Aleppo until Fua and Kafraya were freed. Syrian state TV today broadcast scenes from western Aleppo celebrating the rebels' defeat. But behind Assad's soon-to-be victory in the city, there are two great powers in Syria who call the shots. Russia, whose air campaign this past year has put Assad on the ascendant, and Iran, whose militias stretch in a Shia crescent through Syria and Iraq to Lebanon. And today in Moscow, they sat at the table together, without the US or the UN. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and opposite him his Iranian counterpart, deciding Syria's fate.
It's a good moment for us to understand that it's time to provide help for the Syrian people and start political talks to find a political solution, considering that there's no military solution to the Syrian crisis, only a political one.
A political process which, together with Turkey's foreign minister, they vowed would include Syria's President Bashar al-Assad.
Iran, Russia and Turkey express readiness to act in favour and become guarantors of the agreement that is being prepared and negotiated at the moment by the Syrian government and opposition.
President Assad always said his fight was a secular one in defence of the complex weave of Syrian ethnicities and religions. But the battle is increasingly being fought along sectarian lines, and Assad is going along with it, prepared to back policies little short of cleansing to achieve his ends.
Diana Magnay reporting. And before we explore what's been happening in Moscow a bit further, let's go back now to Germany for some reaction to the Berlin Christmas market attack. And we're joined from the city by Matthias Kollatz-Achenen. He is a regional politician from the left-leaning SPD party. Matthias Kollatz-Achenen, the police operation does seem really to be in some trouble tonight. It looks very unlikely that they'll ever find the man who did this.
Excuse me?
Matthias, can you hear me?
No
it's
contact.
Jon Snow in London. Let me try. No, he's not able, I think, to hear us.
Now I hear you, but so far I didn't hear anything.
OK, I'll just ask you this question again. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me, sir? No, I'm sorry, there is a problem going to Berlin. So let's move on. Well, now, as I said, we're going to continue with the issue of that Moscow summit. Have this week's momentous events further played into Putin's hands and at the expense of the West? From Moscow, we're joined by Dmitry Babic, a journalist with Sputnik News. And I'd like to ask you, first of all, Mr. Babic,
yes.
How do you see what is happening here? Has this Moscow's victory?
I think it would be preposterous to view it as a victory or defeat of Moscow. What is important is that three important neighbors of Syria have finally spoken with one voice. It was very reassuring to hear from the Turkish defense minister that what happened in Aleppo was a liberation and that people are being evacuated and that this operation is successful. If you told me 6 months ago that we would hear it from the Turkish minister, I wouldn't have believed you. So for the first time in many years, there is a chance for peace for Syria because it is supported by very important countries such as Russia, Iran and Turkey. Unfortunately, the West is not taking part in that.
Right. I want to come back to you on that in just a moment, but I'm just going to go to you, Sasha Kavličić. This is an extraordinary moment. This is a moment in which a Middle East crisis is being resolved with no involvement of the United Nations, no involvement of the West, and a domination by Moscow and Iran and Turkey. And is this the new world order or simply a blip?
It's a brave new world. I think there's no question that Russia is effectively the net winner of the chaos and the tragedies of 2016. And in fact, its shadow looms large across Europe with the far right, with the issue, of course, of Syria, remaking, if you like, the Middle East. But we have seen Russia very skillfully bring to the table and play off the often competing interests of Iran and Turkey. This is extraordinary. How long the alliance with Iran will last is another question, whether those interests are aligned. But it is extraordinary that while President Obama commented as if he were an external commentator to the issue of Aleppo, commented that the blood of these people was on Russia's hands, as if he had no part in the game. But extraordinary times.
Isn't there a certain amount of logic? I mean, after all, these are powers. Iran is a 6,000-year-old civilization. Turkey is a significant country. Russia is a significant country. Maybe they'll make a better fist of the Middle East than the West has managed.
They have interests, obviously, in the region. The question, of course, will be for the Syrian people, what prevails. Putin's bet is that he can button up this conflict by shoring up Assad. My fear is, my belief is, that ultimately this conflict cannot end with Assad in power.
Well, let me just say that there's a breaking news right now. The Islamic states are claiming the Berlin attack for themselves. Mr. Putin may not have any better solution to fighting radical Islamic terrorism than the West have managed.
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, what we will see is the continuation of the guerrilla warfare, essentially on the ground. And of course, we see now this challenge posed to Europe. Returning foreign fighters, a very, very big problem for Europe, but also, of course, the whole region. And as we see gains made on the battlefield, that challenge grows, of course, in terms of the terrorist outcome.
Well, we're joined now from central London by Peter Oborne, who has done some significant reporting out of Iran over the past couple of years. Peter Oborne, how do you read this? Here is Iran assertive, but is it President Rouhani or is it the Revolutionary Guards and their strong-armed leaders?
Well, I definitely think your correspondents are completely right. We have a new security architecture in the Middle East. Actually, Aleppo has purely confirmed that. It's been obvious for quite a long time that the West has become irrelevant, that the key powers are in Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria, and that they have won this conflict between, I think, the Syrian civil war.
But it's worth putting it to you, Peter, that the West didn't make a great fist of this. I mean, they made a mess of Iraq. They've made a mess of attempting to beat Islamic State so far in Syria. You know, perhaps a few other players will have a better chance.
I certainly think that the West has been a complete disaster, starting with the Iraq war, and then, of course, we've had our disastrous attempt to set things right in Libya, and of course we've meddled a great deal in Syria. People keep on saying that we haven't been in Syria. Actually, we have, and we are, and there's a lot of Western activity in Syria, and our allies, of course, have been fueling the rebels, and so yes, this has been Western policy has been a shambles.
Right. Mr. Babbage, can we just ask you, do you think Mr. Putin has a plan for in some way containing the myriad of guerrilla groups on both sides in the Syrian conflict, none of whom seem to be directly answerable to any of the powers that have met in Moscow today?
Well, I don't think that we have solutions for everything here in Moscow. Russia's goal in Syria is pretty limited. I can tell you the two elements. The first element is to prevent the creation of a terrorist extremist state of quasi-Islamic character. We had a terrible war in Chechnya until the funding for the terrorists there came from abroad, so we don't want another situation like that. And the second is to stop the juggernaut that has been removing governments, good or bad, in the Middle East since 2003, you know. So these are the two goals which Russia wants to achieve in Syria. Of course, we cannot resolve all of Syria's problems. It's up to Syrians to elect their government and to decide how they're going to live in future.
Right. OK, well, Sasha Kavlovich, how do you respond to that? And what do you foresee in 2017? I mean, 2016 has been one of the most dreadful years since the Second World War.
Yes.
What is coming up?
Well, the question is how long Putin wants to be engaged. With an economy half the size of Britain's, this is expensive work. But then again, Russia's foreign policy has always been a function of its domestic needs, and I believe is very popular. So he will play those issues off domestically. The big unknown factor, of course, is Donald Trump. and how he comes in on this world stage. Of course, there are signals that it's going to be a much warmer relationship with Putin. Where he comes in on this question of Syria, though, is something of an open-ended question.
Let's ask Mr. Babbage about Mr. Trump. I mean, is Mr. Trump going to be a great assistant to Mr. Putin, or do you think, in fact, that the American system will ensure that he behaves himself?
I don't know what you mean by behaving oneself. If he starts to behave like Barack Obama, then it will be a disaster. I think Obama has been the worst president in the history of the United States. Just look at the results in Syria, in Libya, and especially with the election in the United States. Donald Trump, I think, is a big enigma to us. So far, on the emotional level, he reacts in the right way. For example, he reacted in the right way to the terrorist act in Berlin. Instead of, doing this wishy-washy hesitation like Chancellor Merkel, who shied away from calling it what it was, he called it what it was.
Okay, let me pause you there. Let me pause you there, Dimitri. Let me pause you there for the moment. Peter Oborne, what do you make of it? I mean, castigating Mr. Obama, sort of enigma in Mr. Trump. How do you foresee the next few months in terms of what happens between these powers?
Well, there's a very interesting paradox about Trump. On the one hand, he has said that he wants to do a deal with Mr. Putin, and that first summit meeting will be quite something. But on the other hand, Mr. Trump's rhetoric against Iran has been really pungent. Now, whether you can be against Iran and be committed to its downfall and in favor of Putin is a very nice point, given the closeness of that alliance. And something you said just now was interesting. The American deep state is deeply opposed to any sort of deal with Putin. The CIA is sort of mutinous, it's pretty obvious. And whether Trump will be able to bring into effect any of his policies with regard to Putin remains to be seen.
Peter Oborne, thank you very much for joining us. Dimitri Babbage, thank you very much indeed. And Sasha Kavlicek, thank you very much indeed too. Jackie.
Now, Scotland inside the single market, even if the rest of the UK is out. That's top of Nicola Sturgeon's wish list as she called for more powers to protect Scottish interests after Brexit. Opposition parties claimed her plan was simply window dressing for independence. So is she really after a second referendum? Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports from Edinburgh.
Where the Westminster government remains opaque about what it wants from the EU, today the SNP government in Edinburgh was blunt. Scotland must stay within the single market.
It is estimated that being outside the single market could cost the Scottish economy 80,000 jobs. Workers could lose £2,000 a year within a decade of a hard Brexit.
But she threatened Theresa May that if her demands were ignored, there'd be a second referendum on independence.
The option of independence must remain on the table. Without this option, Scotland would simply have to accept the inevitability of whatever decisions the UK government makes, no matter how damaging they are to Scotland's interests.
Since Theresa May came to see her here in July, 2 days after becoming PM, Nicola Sturgeon and her colleagues have concluded the May government won't try to stay within the single market or the customs union. Hence, the SNP wants a differential deal for Scotland.
Isn't it just totally unrealistic to expect Theresa May to go along to these negotiations and say, well, this is what we, the UK, want. Oh, and while I'm here, this is a different arrangement that Scotland wants. You're not going to get a deal in those circumstances.
Scotland has been told repeatedly, it was told this very forcibly in the independence referendum 2 years ago, that the UK is a partnership of equals. Now, I'm simply making the point that if that is to mean something in reality as opposed to just in rhetoric, then surely there must be a willingness to find a way that effectively squares the circle of the different outcomes in different parts of the UK. Will it be easy? No.
Coffee, please, and a hot chocolate, please.
This economist chairs Nicola Sturgeon's Council of Advisors on Europe. One of those advisors today said it was extremely difficult to see how the SNP plan would work legally, technically or politically. But Anton Muscatelli disagrees.
Is this really practical, that the UK leaves the European Union but that Scotland remains in the single market?
I think it is practical, it is technically and legally feasible.
But if there was freedom of movement between Scotland and the rest of the European Union, but wouldn't this mean that people would just use Scotland as a backdoor way to getting into England and Wales?
That misunderstands a key issue, which is around the control of immigration. Most of the control of immigration doesn't happen in borders, because borders are where visitors come in as well as people who intend to reside. A lot of that could be done by regulation in the labour market and employers. We see that already around the world. There are differential visa arrangements depending on where people want to reside.
So the Scottish exports to the rest of the United Kingdom.
But Tories say Scotland should concentrate on its more important economic relationship with the rest of the UK.
And if the Scottish Government were really serious about working with Theresa May's government to try and secure the best Brexit deal, not just for Scotland, but for the whole of the UK, then they would drop their sabre-rattling about independence, they would drop their sabre-rattling about a second independence referendum, and they would get on with the job of working with the UK to get the best possible Brexit deal for all of us.
And today, Theresa May told MPs Scottish independence would be the worst of all worlds.
If Scotland were to become independent, then not only would it no longer be a member of the European Union, it would no longer be a member of the single market of the European Union, and it would no longer be a member of the single market of the United Kingdom. And the single market of the United Kingdom is worth 4 times as much to Scotland as the single market of the European Union.
As Theresa May prepares finally to set out her stall for negotiations next spring, she's promised to consider the Scottish Government's plans carefully. But they're an extra complication she'd rather do without.
Well, I think it's pretty unlikely that in the next few weeks Theresa May is going to agree to the contents of this document, particularly on the single market, not least because it might lead to others, Northern Ireland, Wales, maybe even London, demanding their own separate deals. And quite frankly, the European deal is going to be complicated enough on its own. But it wouldn't necessarily mean either there would be a second referendum, because at the end of the day, the Scottish Government is only going to have a second referendum if it thinks it can win a second referendum. But if the British Government rejects these plans on the single market, then that might change the atmosphere here and make it rather easier to convince public opinion here this time they should go for independence.
Michael, thanks very much. John.
After the break, the legal ruling which could allow thousands of foreign students to stay in the United Kingdom. Plus, Green campaigners are furious after a court gives the green light for fracking to start in North Yorkshire. Fracking for shale gas can now go ahead in North Yorkshire after environmental campaigners lost a legal challenge, arguing that the council had failed to take the impact of climate change into account. But the judgment means Third Energy will now be able to begin fracking at the site in Kirkby Misperton in Rydale. Campaigners and locals call it a bitter blow, and it could have wider implications too, as our science editor Tom Clark now reports.
The small North Yorkshire village of Kirkby Misperton is now back on track to be the first place in the UK to frack for natural gas. In May, the county council gave drilling firm Third Energy the green light to frack this existing gas well on the outskirts of the village. And today, campaigners' efforts to have that decision overturned failed at the High Court.
It's a disappointing judgment as far as we're concerned. The bottom line is, whatever happened, we'd only be able to delay the fracking here at Kirkby Misperton. We'd never have been able to stop it per se.
Campaigners argued that North Yorkshire County Council had failed to consider the true impacts of fracking on climate change when it granted permission in May this year. The High Court disagreed. Add to that the government's intervention a few months ago to give fracking the go-ahead near this site in Lancashire, and you'd think it was time for campaigners to admit defeat.
Well, there are now hundreds of local groups across the country, residents groups, community groups, who are all coming together to try and stop fracking. So far they've been successful. Obviously, some of the powers that be are against them, but with overwhelming local opposition to this as a technology, with very dubious economics, with evidence increasing around the world of the potential harm of this industry, and the growing understanding that actually we have to keep fossil fuels in the ground, there is still definitely hope.
But they'll have their work cut out. Successive governments have supported fracking as a source of locally sourced energy. There are gas-bearing rocks under much of the UK being actively marketed by government. These are the current blocks of land across Britain for which companies have recently won licences to explore for fracking. Third Energy and the onshore gas industry welcomed the news.
It's good news for the country. 84% of our homes are heated by gas, and 80% of that gas in 15 years' time will come from outside the UK. All activity, whether it's housing, whether it's wind farms, whether it's shale gas, has an impact. What we have to do as an industry is to reduce that impact to as low as possible and to do things environmentally sensitively and safely, which is exactly what we're going to do.
But there are greater forces determining the future of fracking in the UK. It could be far more costly here than on the empty plains of North America. That's not to mention tough climate change targets which really start to bite around 2030. If the fracking industry wants to make the most of shale gas in Britain, it's got to get drilling.
Tom Clark reporting. Well, some good news for Christmas travellers. A planned 48-hour strike by airport baggage handlers and check-in staff has been called off following talks at the conciliation service, ACAS. Members of the Unite union employed by Swissport have called off industrial action. The union said the strike had been cancelled after an improved pay offer, which it will recommend to its members.
Judges called it an abuse of power by the Home Office. Now, a foreign student who's had his right to stay in the United Kingdom cancelled after his English proficiency test was deemed invalid has had the decision quashed. It's a significant ruling which could potentially also affect thousands of other foreign students who had their visas cancelled. Mohammed Mohibullah will now be able to remain in Britain as long as he can find an alternative place to study, as Asad Beg now reports.
Although some of these institutions are legitimate, for many their product is not an education but immigration.
It was one of Theresa May's flagship campaigns as Home Secretary. A clampdown on bogus students and the institutions allowing them to play the immigration system.
Many of those were only supposed to be coming for short courses. We will reduce the numbers of bogus students coming here to study.
Since then, over 50,000 international students have been targeted, accused of cheating or having questionable results on English proficiency tests. A landmark decision in the case of one student, Mohammed Mohibullah, could pave the way for thousands of other students to appeal the decision to cancel their visas.
Mohammed had a place to study business here at a now defunct college called Blakehall, but in 2014 he and more than 200 others were asked to leave after the Home Office said that the English tests they'd passed, which gave them the right to remain in Britain, were invalid.
Mohammed has been fighting his case for over 2 years.
So I can't study, I can't work, and I have to wait for my judgment.
But he admits the voice on the English test he took wasn't his, but says he doesn't know how that happened.
The voice that they sent you is not yours.
I don't know whose it is, but what ETS and Home Office is saying that this same voice was found matched with 6 other candidates' voice. So this voice, they are saying that this is a proxy voice which has been used for 6 other exams as well.
Did you use a proxy for your test?
No, I never used it proxy because I didn't have to, actually, to be honest. It's not only about the voice clips because if you just think actually what really happened, also the exam procedure, the way the exam happened, there is lots of room for the doubt.
Mohammed's allegedly fraudulent exam was one of tens of thousands deemed invalid. Many test centres and colleges that were implicated in cheating have since closed.
Mohammed's case wasn't about whether he faked his English test or not. He disputes this, saying that there must have been a mistake made somewhere. What it was about was the grounds on which the Home Office cancelled his right to stay here.
Today, an immigration tribunal quashed the Home Office's decision against him. The Home Office, from all the options open to them, went for the toughest approach. They offered Mohammed no leave to appeal. This, the judges said, was wrong.
The Secretary of State's decision was so unfair and unreasonable as to amount to an abuse of power.
The Home Office should follow the law and should not act unfairly. It's our firm view that the Secretary of State ought to have done her homework before launching these quite strong attacks on students without giving them an opportunity to provide an innocent explanation. They've been treated absolutely appallingly.
Today, the court said Mohammed was entitled to stay in the country until mid-February to enable him to find a place on another course. The judgment could have implications for tens of thousands of other students. The Home Office did not respond to our requests for comment. The judgment has cast a shadow over the Home Office's approach to some international students. The government could be forced to allow thousands to stay and potentially even more back into the country.
Asad Beg reporting.
Well, after the break, a literary legacy for the nation. We speak to the writer Will Self, who's been invited by the British Library to help curate his own archive for their august shelves. Libraries, he wrote, will soon become redundant, overtaken by the rapid march of technology. But the writer Will Self is now part of his own literary legacy, which is being preserved in the British Library for all posterity. He's one of several writers invited to curate their own archive, with everything from sketches and drafts for novels to letters from family and fellow authors. I went to the British Library to find out more.
The best book's the next one. You know, like anybody else, I'm kind of looking to the future rather than the past. I mean, you know, posterity is a bit of a dirty word, I think, for any working creative artist.
Will Self may look to the future, but all his words, past, present, and those still to be beaten out on his trusty typewriter, are to be preserved for that so-called dirty word, posterity. At 55, his work and the things which inspired it are being archived by the British Library.
And that's, you know, where it's all going to be.
Sharing a space with Shakespeare, Austen and Woolf, among many others. There's an obvious advantage to archiving the work of someone who's still alive. In Self's case, helping to explain some of the hundreds and hundreds of post-it notes he's collected over the years.
So you can see I tend to do
like
quite
a post-it note as well.
I like a post-it note. I used to work in an office and I'd put these post-it notes up on the wall. As I'm working on a book, they come down off the walls and go into these notebooks, which are categorised.
So you create order out of the odd post-it note going up?
Well, I mean, you wanted, Jackie, to complete that phrase as order out of chaos.
I was stupid.
I mean, arguably, some critics might say I create chaos out of chaos.
Making order out of the archive isn't an easy task either. With 11 novels and a huge collection of essays, articles and even cartoons to his name, there's an enormous amount of background material. What do you think it tells people, either about you or about the work itself?
Well, I think if you're a literary critic or a literary biographer, then these kinds of resources, you know, where you've got the actual typescripts of books, you've got the notes that were behind them. Yeah, I think it gives you a sense of a rounded picture of the kind of milieu out of which these works came.
What would be the thing you would hope people would take away from it if people come and look at?
Oh, I hope nobody ever looks at it at all.
The archive also includes private letters, postcards and photographs, family documents and notes. Self says he was happy for it to be warts and all.
I've been in the public eye for a very, very long time, so I'm used to that idea that there's, you know, that I'm more on show perhaps than some other people. In a way, people's social media existence and their relationship with the web now is like creating an ongoing personal archive all the time. So in a sense, it's not that different to people who are watching this and are kind of posting tweets and chucking stuff into the cloud.
The very notion of archiving a body of work has perhaps taken on new significance in a digital world. Will Self acknowledges that writing has changed with the advent of the internet. Ever the contrarian, as technology raced ahead, in 2004 he decided to go backwards, starting to work on a typewriter again.
Working on a wireless-enabled computer is actually inimical to writing novels.
But why?
Well, you're typing along, right? And, you know, to be a serious writer, and if you view prose as poetry, as I do, you think in words. And if you're writing, you know, and you're thinking, oh, you've got a character in a Morris Traveller, and you think, oh, I better have a look at a Morris Traveller. Suddenly you're looking at a Morris Traveller on the screen. Then you're describing the Morris Traveller. You're not thinking in words. It's not the same phenomenon. And of course, the distraction of it is also phenomenal. You might buy a pair of oven gloves or decide to see what some unfeasible sexual position looks like. I know a lot of people out there do that.
Not speaking personally.
No, absolutely not.
And what of the much talked about death of the novel, and by extension, the end of the novelist?
In the late 80s, novelists were gods. We had groupies. You know, it already has changed. Nobody feels any shame about not reading contemporary writers of significance at all, or even the greats. We've moved into a different culture. I don't think the novel's ever going to die, but it's definitely going to become a secondary mode.
Why then do you continue to write in this form on the typewriter with a view to creating a book?
It's a form I love. I love the novel form. I've trained quite hard to write them. You know, the fact that they're not quite as en vogue as they used to be is kind of not the point.
Well, Will Self joins me now, and also here is the writer Paris Lees, whose work is archived at the Bishopsgate Institute. Will Self, I mean, does archiving become more or less relevant in a digital age?
Well, I suppose in some sense you could look upon the paper archives that are being built now as analogous to the last of the pharaoh's tombs before the end of the Egyptian civilization. So in that sense, they may have great significance because as an example of the end of this particular form of knowledge technology. However, I simply do not think that the kind of paper-based literary criticism, literary biography that grew up in the 20th century and became a huge industry in a way and grafted in our university system is going to continue into the period of digitisation.
I mean, Paris Lees, your work has been archived. What do you think is the point of that?
Well, I think it's important to note that the published work has been archived. So actually, some of the pieces that I think have been most powerful and have made the biggest impact are actually online. So I think that the Bishopsgate Institute are thinking of doing an online archive as well. So I do think that we're at an interesting point in history. I collect everything. I'm a bit of a hoarder, and I think it is important to have that stuff. But where do you leave it? You know, we're going to start archiving tweets of notable people. You know, their whole timeline, and I don't think anyone really knows where that leaves us. So it's been part of this digital revolution where, you know, who knows?
And do you agree with Will's point that in a way we're all archived because of we're living online now?
To an extent, but I think that, for example, I wrote for one website and then they updated their website and all the pieces were lost. So I think that we can get a bit complacent and just assume that if you go back to somewhere that the piece that you wrote or that you like of somebody else's, it will always be there, and you can't rely on that, actually. So I think that these paper archives are still important, but it's how they're implemented.
And why does it matter that we keep this stuff, that it's still there, that we can access it?
Well, I think traditionally, why these archives have built up, and, you know, I mean, bizarre to relate, I was first approached to sell my archive 20 years ago, so you know, it was really kind of, they were virtually tearing the paper off the typewriter before I could finish it. And I think it's because a complex idea had grown up that you could learn a lot about the way a writer developed a piece by looking at different versions, looking at the flanking material, the notes, all of that stuff. And that in itself became a kind of industry. I don't think that's going to persist.
But does it teach us anything about the world at large, individuals, writers, and how they might write But what about the world and our history, individual archives? Does that...
You'd like to think so, wouldn't you? But I mean, I'm just really despairing at the moment and feeling quite depressed about the state of the world. And the 20th century was one of the most documented periods of history. And, you know, the Second World War, we've got all of the information about that. And yet we seem to be making the same mistakes. So I'd love to think that people would learn from history. But, you know, no one seems to be bothered. You know, they've got the facts in front of them, and we just seem to be marching onwards, and it's really depressing.
But is it because there's too much information and actually we self-select? We select what we want to read, what we want to...
There's a vast amount of information. There's more than anybody can get hold of. Bear in mind, before the web, you would have to go to a library really to get books that are not that uncommon. You'd have to engage physically. You know, the process of looking, as it were, at analogue material was an analogue process that involved your moving towards it. So it is a very different culture. And I'm afraid I slightly disagree with Paris. I mean, it is all out there. I mean, it's vastly out there. I mean, as somebody who works as a university teacher, as a writer, I can get just about anything I need with the terminal very quickly.
I'm really sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Will Self, Paris Lees, thank you so much. John.
And that's all we've got time for. We're back at 7 tomorrow night, but until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a great evening.